Hello everyone and welcome to Intellipaat. This is the part 4 of the Azure Data Engineer video series. Now let us take a look at the agenda for this video. Firstly, I'll be explaining why use Azure SQL, followed by some of the Azure SQL security capabilities. But before we begin, make sure you subscribe to our YouTube channel and hit the bell icon for regular updates.
Let's move to the next concept. So why should we choose Azure SQL? There are a couple of pointers in here. Frictionless migration. So it accelerates your on-premises SQL Server migration without changing the application code with managed instance. So this is something that I was talking about. If you have an on-premises SQL Server, Microsoft says that your SQL MI is 100% compatible with your on-premises SQL. So there won't be much changes required in your code. It can automatically move from on-premises to MI. Always have the latest SQL Server capabilities in the cloud with an evergreen SQL database that requires no patching or upgrading for you. This is again I have talked about. You don't have to bother about the patching or the upgradation. You always have the latest SQL engine. All the administrative activities are taken care by Microsoft. Built-in machine learning. Get peak database performance and durability with safe, reliable, and proven AI technology. So this is something that I was showing you. Let me go to my database. So you see here, Microsoft talks about the performance overview, what is going on, what are the recommendations that they have for you, what is the query performance, if you have run any query, how much query it has run, what are the tunings that you can do. So all these things are done by Microsoft. So I told you, right, they have an AI running at the backend which monitors your data pattern and it gives you recommendations. Maximize the performance of your application with customized auto tuning recommendation. This is the auto tuning recommendation. So we have seen this. We were working in a project and they had Azure SQL DB, and Microsoft actually recommended us to create indexes on couple of columns. And if you set it as on, Microsoft will automatically create the indexes for you. You don't have to do it itself. Use intelligent insights monitor and detect disruptive events that can cause poor performance. Again, if you go to this query performance insight, it shows you what are the queries which is using the maximum IO, maximum CPU, what is the longest running queries that you have in here. Unmatched scale and high availability. Scale your applications on demand with 99.995% availability. So I told you Microsoft has an SLA of 99.995. I actually said 99% availability. Scale compute and storage resource independently for maximum flexibility and lower your costs with discount readable replicas. So as we saw, when we want to scale out or scale down, our database will not get affected. We can just go to this configure here, and from here we can easily change our configuration. It's that simple. Built-in high availability in Azure SQL Database guarantees that databases will never be single point of failure in your software architecture. So if you remember, when we are working in on-premises SQL Server, there is a concept called as high availability. So when we are working on Azure SQL, Microsoft always guarantees high availability. So the Azure SQL database is actually built on the concept of high availability. So whenever you're working on it, this high availability is baked in part of your license. Advanced data security protects your data from malicious acts with fine-grained access control, always encrypted technology, and advanced threat detection capabilities. So if you go in here again, so you can see in the security, you have advanced data security. Let's go in here. So Microsoft will actually check that what is your database doing. So what are the I'm not saying Microsoft will read your data. No, they will not read your data. Your data is still secure, but they will check. And if you allow Microsoft, they can read your data and give you a recommendation based on that. They can do auditing for that also. They can check the server, what is going on. So you see server level auditing is disabled. If I do it on, it can check that what is the storage that you're using, how much is getting used, do you want any recommendation on that. All these things are also baked in part of your Azure SQL DB. Now let's talk about the security capabilities in detail. So the security strategy described follows the layered defense in depth approach as shown in the picture below, and moves from the outside in. So the outside layer is network security. So this is the most common thing. So you see that until and unless I add my client IP, I am not able to access the Azure SQL DB. That is the first layer. Then the second layer that we have is access management. So access management is something that we have all worked in SQL. That is, you can create a group of resource, you can create a pool of resources who can access. Then you have threat protection. So threat protection is something that Microsoft automatically does onto your SQL Server. So what Microsoft does is it checks for if there is any threat on your SQL DB or not. If Microsoft finds out that there is some security loophole in your database, Microsoft will immediately ring you. Ring you, when I say, it means that it will notify you and say that there is a security flaw that we have found in your database. If you want, Microsoft can remediate that for yourself, or if you don't want, you can go to the Azure portal and you can fix it yourself as well. Then you have information protection. So information protection means you can have row level security in Azure SQL. So that is something that is already baked in on premises. You can perform row level security that is also available in Azure SQL. And finally, the customer data. So this is the core of any database, where the data that the customer has will be always secure. So there are different layers of security which Azure SQL provides. Network security. Let's talk about this a little detail. Microsoft Azure SQL Database provides a relational database service for cloud enterprise applications. To help protect customer data, firewalls prevent network access to the database server until access is explicitly granted based on the IP address or Azure VPN. We talked about this. Access management. Sorry, this is part of the network security. IP firewall rules grant access to databases based on the originating IP address for each request. So when I gave my IP address, and after that only Microsoft enabled us to connect to the Azure SQL. Virtual network. So let's say that I have created a virtual network. So virtual network service endpoints enable Azure SQL databases to identify the virtual network subnet that traffic originated from. So if you're putting your Azure SQL behind a subnet, then obviously you have to connect to it via a VNet. So that is another layer of security. Virtual network service endpoints extend your virtual network connectivity over the Azure backbone. So if you're creating an Azure VNet, so it's another layer of security. One, at the top level, you have a virtual network, then you create a subnet of that and put it inside the Azure VNet. That is also possible to do in Azure SQL. To allow traffic to reach Azure SQL database, use SQL service tags to allow outbound traffic through network security group. So what is a network security group? A network security group, or NSG, is actually the placeholder on which all your network activities are carried forward. So you can create your VNet, you can create your subnet, and everything will be part of your network security group, or NSG. Now, if you want to allow inbound or outbound traffic, if you have kept your Azure SQL inside a VNet, you can configure that from the NSG. Virtual network rules enable Azure SQL database to only accept communication that are sent from selected subnets inside a virtual network. So you see that the first layer of security that I have given is that you cannot access the Azure SQL outside of the VNet. The second thing that I can do is, inside the VNet also, I can create multiple subnets, and I can say that only these 3 subnets can access the Azure SQL. So you have that granular server security from Azure SQL. Now let's talk about access management. So how many ways we can connect to the SQL DB. So remember one thing, since this is an Azure SQL, so there is no Windows authentication in this Azure SQL because it doesn't run on a Windows server. Well, at the backbone, it might run on Linux server, but since only the database is exposed, you cannot have a Windows authentication. So managing the databases and database servers with Azure is controlled by the portal using the account role assignment. Authentication is the process of providing the user who they claim to be. So when we come to Azure SQL, we have 2 types of authentication: SQL authentication and Active Directory authentication. Now, when we come to Active Directory, again, we have different versions. So let me show you from here. So you see that I have SQL Server authentication. When I come to Active Directory authentication, I have three things: Active Directory authentication with multi-factor authentication, Active Directory authentication with password, and Active Directory authentication integrated. So how do they differ? Let me show you what is Active Directory authentication first. So SQL Server authentication is the most simplest one. You create a SQL admin and you access your SQL Server using SQL Server authentication. That's the most simple thing. So SQL Database authentication refers to authentication a user when connecting to Azure SQL Database using a username and password. This is the most simple thing that we have all used. There's nothing more to discuss in. Now, what is an Active Directory authentication? So to understand Active Directory authentication, we have to understand what is an Active Directory first. Azure Active Directory authentication is a mechanism of connecting to Azure SQL Database and SQL Data Warehouse by identifying the Azure Active Directory. A server admin called the Azure Active Directory Administrator must be created to use Azure AD authentication within SQL Database. What it means is that whenever we are going for any of the Active Directory authentication, in Active Directory authentication, you cannot give a SQL username or password. You have to provide your Active Directory. So this is my Active Directory username. Okay. So here I have to provide my Active Directory username, and that is the email ID that I have. And for that, think of it as an Office admin or a SQL admin. So if you have an Active Directory administrator, that Active Directory administrator will create a role for you. That role will be assigned to Azure SQL, saying that, hey, I have a user called as abc@gmail.com. So this abc.gmail.com needs access to this Azure SQL. So I have to provide first Azure SQL with the authentication of this abc@gmail.com. Then you can choose the username. So multi-factor authentication means you will get either a text message or a call, or in the Microsoft Authenticator app, a notification. You have to accept that. If you go for an Active Directory password, you have to provide your username, that is your Active Directory username and your password. If you go for this integrated, this will only work. What's going to happen is, see, it's automatically taken this username. So what's going to happen is, if you're inside the same Active Directory domain, then your username will be work. So typically what we do is, if we are using Active Directory authentication, we keep it using a multi-factor authentication. That's easy to access, because multi-factor gives you the flexibility where you can connect to your Active Directory domain, but you can connect from different region. So that is another way of authenticating that we have in Azure SQL. You can either use a SQL Server authentication or an Azure AD authentication. Authorization refers to permission assigned to a user with Azure SQL Database and determines what the user is allowed to do. So when we talk about authentication, there are two things. One is authorization, next is authentication. Authorization means that the kind of access that you get, meaning the permission. So the first level of security. Permissions are controlled by adding the user's accounts to the database roles and assigning database level permission to those roles by gaining the user certain object level permission. So this is your authorization. You're adding the Active Directory user ID to your database. Okay. Then comes the authentication. This is about the row level security. I'll come to this later. Then comes the authentication. So authentication means that you're actually allowing the traffic to go through the SQL. So first thing is authorization, you're adding the user. Second is authentication. Authentication means when the user connects with the username and password, you cross-validate, okay, so the username is correct. So this is part of my AD group. This is part of my SQL Server. And the password is also matching, so I can let this access flow through. So authorization is adding, authentication is validating. Then we come to the row level security. Again, people who have worked in on-premises SQL, they will know this concept. Row level security means that in Azure SQL, you can give access to certain users who can see only one row of data. So this we call as row level security. This is also available in on-premises SQL. You can set up user groups and you can keep row level security. So what's going to happen is, any user with a very limited access can only see one row of data, not more than that. That is also available in Azure SQL. Then this is about the SQL auditing in Azure Monitor and Event Hub. This is nothing but this option. Where did that option go? So you see here the alerts, metrics, diagnostic setting, and logs. So what's going to happen is, let's take a scenario. So let's say that I have an on-premises SQL server and I can create a query execution plan and I can export that query execution plan. Now, how do I know that? Let's say that in last 1 hour, how many queries have run and what was the output, how much IO was used, how much index was used, what was the index seek and what was the index scan. How can I do that in on-premises? I can write my query and get a result out. Microsoft from Azure SQL gives you a flexibility. So what you can do is you can create a log analytics workspace. That is another service from Microsoft. You can create a log analytics workspace and you can add this Azure SQL to that log analytics workspace. So now what's going to happen is I can create my metrics. So in this metric, I can create multiple formula. How much? See, you can see all these things we can do. What are the metrics? What are the CPU limit? What are the CPU percentage? What are the CPU percentage used? How much data was used? Did I have any deadlock or not? Did I have any failed connection or not? All these different metrics I can select. And this is only for one SQL. If I want to use different SQLs, I can do that. And based on that, so let me select only one. Let's select SQL limit. Let's select the average. And you can create graphs on this. So at any given point of time, how much utilization has happened. If I save this, it will automatically show up in a log analytics workspace. So you can see it in a graphical format. You can show it in a chart format also. So automatically you will get resource insights of what is going on in your SQL. So this flexibility is also available. Let's talk about advanced threat protection. So advanced threat protection is analyzing your SQL Server logs and detect unusual behavior and potentially harmful attempts to access and exploit databases. So again, this is something that you have to enable. Microsoft by default doesn't enable it because of your data privacy. If you enable it, Microsoft can read your log and they can give you suggestions that, hey, I see this loophole, you can fix it. Then this is the transport layer security or the TLS. So this is something that we have seen in here. SQL Server database secures customer data by encrypting data in motion with transport layer security. SQL Server enforces encryption in SSL TLS at all the times for all the connections. So as you know that all the data in SQL Server goes by the port 1433. And since this is a SQL on Azure, obviously the data goes via the HTTPS network, not just the HTTPS traffic. All the data that flows in and out on this Azure SQL, they go via the SSL TLS layer. So you always have the capacity of the transport security layer for your threats. This ensures that all data in transit means your inbound data and your outbound data, the client and the server, irrespective of the setting of the encrypted or the trust server certificate, is in the connection string. So it is another layer of extra security that Microsoft provides on top of the transport, on top of the HTTPS layer, the SSL TLS layer. So any given point of time that the data that you're using, this is secure. So this is again another guarantee from Microsoft. This is an example. So let's say that when using a .NET driver that is accomplished via the encrypt true and trust server certificate as false. If you obtain your connection string from the Azure portal, it will have the correct settings. So this is just an example. If you're connecting to the Azure SQL via ADO.NET connector. Next, let's talk about transparent data encrypt or the encrypted list. Transparent Data Encrypt or TDE for Azure SQL Database adds a layer of security to help protect data at rest from unauthorized or offline access to raw files or backups. So not just your live data, your backup data or your offline data is also part of this security mechanism. In Azure, all newly created SQL databases are by default encrypted, and the database encryption key is protected by the built-in server certificate. So there are a lot of security layers that we have in Azure SQL. So this is not just related to Azure SQL. This is something related to the whole Azure ecosystem, is Azure Key Vault. Azure Key Vault is a key management service. So let me give an example. So let's say that I have created a Azure SQL database, just like I created. So I gave a username, I gave a password. So now let's say that I am a database administrator for this Azure SQL. So tomorrow, if I leave the organization, who should I send the password to, the database administrative password, or where should I write it? I cannot write it in a text pad. I should not send it over the email. So where should I write it? Where should I keep all this key? Now think of that in your application. You have Azure SQL, you have Data Factory, you have different connectors, you have Windows services, you have app services. So all these things require username and password. So where should you keep your username and password? So what Microsoft does is Microsoft has a service called as Azure Key Vault. This is dedicated for storing your username and password. So if you create an Azure Key Vault, you can store your username and password in there. Once you store your username and password, Microsoft will encrypt that with AES 256-bit key, and all this username and password will be encrypted. So anytime anybody leaving the organization or coming new, they don't have to remember this. They can just go to that Azure Key Vault, get the password from there, but only the encrypted version. Then you can come and say that, hey, then anybody can go and see the password. That is not the case. So the first layer of security is that the person wants to see the password has to have the access to the Azure portal. Second is that the person who's asking for the password has to have access to this Azure Key Vault service. So if the person does not have access to the Azure portal, does not have access to the Azure Key Vault, your password can never be exposed. So this is dedicated for storing all your username and password, the Azure Key Vault. Now coming to the Azure SQL capabilities, bring your own license or BYOL. This also supports transport data encryption. So remember when I was creating this SQL MI, so it gave me the option to create the BYOL license. So if I give a BYOL license, I cannot just upload my license. I have to create an Azure Key Vault. I have to provide the license in that. Then from the Azure Key Vault, I have to get the license back. So their security is also there. Allows the customers to take ownership of key management and rotation using the Azure Key Vault, Azure's cloud-based external key management system. Azure Key Vault provides a central key management platform, leveraging tightly monitored hardware secure module, and enables separate off duties between management of keys and data to help meet. So this is what Key Vault does in a nutshell, which I just explained. So always encrypted means always encrypted is a feature designed to protect sensitive data stored in specific database columns from access. So this is again people who have worked in on-premises SQL 2016 and above. We have seen this. So we can create a specific column. So let's say that I am creating a table called as employee. So in that employee table, I have a column called as credit card number. So obviously, if I store it as a normal string, anybody logging into the server can see this credit card number, which is a security violation. Okay. Now, what's going to happen is if you store this in a secure column, so there is an option called as enable security. If you set it as true, this column value will get encrypted. So people with a specific key can only see the value of that column. This is available in on-premise SQL. Same thing is available in Azure SQL also. The option is called as always encrypted. If you keep the always encrypted as true, that specific column, for an example, a credit card number or the national identification number, it will become encrypted. Then we have dynamic data masking. So I think I got this question. So I showed you where we can have dynamic data masking. Here is the dynamic data masking. So you can mask your data. So SQL database dynamic data masking limits sensitive data exposure by making it to non-privileged user. Dynamic data masking automatically discovers potentially sensitive data in Azure SQL database and provides actionable recommendation to mask these fields with minimal impact on the application layer. So you see that here it's showing me, do I want to add a mask or not? If I want to add a mask, so see, it has been added. So it's that simple. You just click on add a mask, save it, and your data masking has been added. It's that simple.
Just a quick info, guys. If you want to make a career in data engineering, then Intellipaat provides an advanced certification in data engineering associated with MIT. This course is designed to upskill and land your dream job.